to our last talk by Dr. Parton, the patient who can't read with 20/20 vision.
Oh, it's up there. So once again, I not only get a chance to switch the computer, but also switch your mind. Now, as some of you know, I am a neurologist by primary trade. And what I do in the lab is primarily cognitive neuroscience research, which makes me a bit of an odd duck. But it also means I get some interesting referrals. And one of the interesting things that comes my way once in a while, and which will come your way too, I think, once in a while, is something like this, where somebody says, here's this patient that says that they can't read very well. They've got 20/20 acuity. You're the neuro-ophthalmologist. You tell me why you can't read. So what I'm going to do is I wanted to take you through a series of things. You know, most of the time, reading's a complicated thing. It can range all the way from your eyeball to the most advanced portions of your brain. And of course, most of the eyeball stuff is going to be diagnosable because they don't have 20/20 vision. Their visual acuity is reduced, and you're going to look in the eye and you're going to be able to see why that's the case. But once in a while, you're going to have somebody in whom it's not quite that simple. So what I want to do is go through a few of the things. If you have one slide that I'm going to give you that I want you to remember, it's probably this one. Because if you can go through this, you can probably figure out on a logical, step-by-step way what you got to think about to figure out why reading is impaired in the patient in front of you. Low-level visual processes, that's the eye. But, vision is not just all about visual acuity, right? Visual field is important, and many people tend to forget that. From the point of view of reading, the portion of your visual field that's important is the central 5 degrees. So once in a while, it's a visual field defect in which acuity is not affected, but the central 5 degrees outside of that sort of parafoveal vision is. 2, eye movements. Reading is a sequential process, right? When you see text in front of you, you look, you move your eyes along to pick up information in a stream of information processing. To do that, you have to be able to fixate steadily. If you're reading it close, you have to be able to converge. And you also have to, in that sequential process, to make the jump between fixations, that's the saccades, accurately. 3, you have to be able to employ attention accurately during reading. Reading it's a very complex thing. You need to be able to use your attention and see what's in front of you, and sometimes that's the problem. Once you've got all that input going into your head through vision, your eye movements, and attention, it's all bringing that information together, you need to then start processing this in a more complex fashion. There's 2 things at this level. One is higher level visual processes. That's decoding what you're seeing, the lines, the bars, the bright spots, and the dark spots into letters and words. And then finally the linguistic analysis, taking that complex visual construct your brain has made and then trying to understand the meaning and pronunciation from the word forms in front of your system. So reading can be derailed by a wide variety of problems, and you need to take a little bit of a systematic approach, and I hope this 5-step process is something that can help you with that. So, starting at the bottom, visual fields in reading, right? Hemianopic dyslexia is what happens when you've lost the central 5 degrees. If you've lost it on the left side, well, for our culture, we read from left to right. That's not true of all reading systems, of course, but if you do have a reading system that goes from left to right, this is not really a big problem. It's really only a problem when you have to get back to the beginning for the next line. And so these people read along fine, and then when they go back, there's this little pause where they try to figure out where they need to be. Sometimes they don't get it right, they read the wrong line. This is actually fairly easy to treat. You can treat them by giving them a little ruler that marks the place of where they can be, and they can shift down the text. When they get proficient with this, they can read almost as fast as anybody. Right hemianopia for us is the big problem. Because what happens here is the text that you're trying to read in front of where you're currently fixating is disappearing into the hole in your vision. This prolongs reading times immensely, and you need to make lots of small little fixations and small little saccades to pick up the information. What you can do to try to get around this, ironically, is to give them smaller text. Because smaller, finer print occupies less space, they can actually see more of the words per fixation. You can also, if they have a field defect that's not complete, try to align their text to page obliquely, sometimes even 90 degrees, so that you try to avoid the text falling into their scotoma. There's also, for those people who have a defect that's not amenable to that, there's a reading rehabilitation technique using a left-scrolling device. It's meant to try to make people make larger right-sided saccades that Andrew Leff in London devised and published a control trial showing that this was actually effective in many people. It can be accessed through this website. So as people who learn these reading strategies, they can actually improve with time. Let me give you an example here. This is time on the vertical axis, and what happens here is you're giving the person a text. This is a normal subject. What happens, and this is the horizontal position. As you read text, you start off on the left side of the page, you move over to the right side. When you reach the end of the line, you move back and you start the next line. This is like the typewriter movement, for those of you who remember typewriters. Okay? If you have a left heminopic defect, your movement here is not too bad, but when you try to find the beginning of the next line, you're hunting for it. Okay? And again, you have to hunt for it. And that's a little pause when reading is interrupted because of this scramble to try to figure out where you're supposed to be for the next line. On the other hand, if you have a right heminopia, the little rightward movements are very, very small, and it takes a person this long to read one line, whereas these two subjects only took this long. So here's an example. You think it should be obvious, right? Hold the hands up, you can't see the hand on this side, the heminopic, that's why they can't read. But field defects aren't always that clear cut. This was a 37-year-old man who presented with a motor vehicle accident, he had brief loss of consciousness, and he had complaints of difficulty reading. He was 20/20 in both eyes, and on confrontation testing, he'd been reported this to be normal. But when you do the perimetry, he's got this little hole right in the right inferior parafoveal field. And his MRI did show a very small occipital pole infarct, which was missed in the initial read. So this is an example of how subtle this can sometimes be. It's not always a full field hemianopia, but in this case, it really was a hemifield defect in just exactly the wrong place for reading. Another visual field defect that's kind of interesting is hemifield slide. If you have a bitemporal hemianopia, one of the problems that you sometimes have, if it's complete especially, it doesn't have to be complete though. I've seen this in people who have incomplete hemianopias even, where essentially the nasal field that's left to the person in one eye, of course, doesn't overlap with the nasal field that's preserved in the other eye because it's a heteronymous hemianopia, right? That means that there's no visual field that one eye sees that the other eye also sees, which means there's no way of keeping the two eyes aligned by using visual information. So the eyes start to slide around. This is what Trevor Kirkham in Montreal described quite a few years ago. If the eyes slide vertically, you get a little vertical step defect in the text, which can scramble your reading quite significantly. If the eyes start to go exotropic, then you have a little overlap in the middle, which gives you this kind of weird double vision where it's only items around the middle that are double. On the other hand, if the eyes then drift in the esotropic direction, you develop a little vertical scotoma right in the middle so that there's a gap in what you're trying to read. You can imagine if your eyes are drifting around all the time, this can make reading very confusing. And indeed, this is exactly what happened with this young woman who presented with 3 days of episodic diplopia. When she was reading, letters would suddenly double. At other times, they would disappear as she was trying to read. And across the room, she would see vertical steps in the windowsills and door frames, right smack in the middle. She did not notice her visual loss. And she did have a complete bitemporal hemianopia from this big pituitary tumor. But it presented with a reading problem, not hemifield loss. 2, eye movements and reading. Three things you need. One is steady fixation. As you're trying to forget information, you don't need to hold it for very long. Reading's very fast, but you need to be able to kind of keep your eyes steady to get that information. If you have nystagmus in a prime musician, that's going to make it difficult. Congenital people already know about that. If you have an acquired nystagmus, though, they may not know they have this. If it's on a vestibular basis, they're usually too dizzy to read anyway and throwing up. They don't complain of reading problems. But central disorders may be a bit more subtle. Those subjects may not notice the oscillopsia so much. They may notice only something's funny about their reading. And the classic example is downbeat nystagmus, again, because downbeat nystagmus often is worse than downgaze, which is where you're trying to read. Saccadic intrusions can do a similar thing. People with opsoclonus and ocular flutter have great difficulty reading, but it's really the oscillopsia, not the reading problem that's driving them crazy. Another interesting study showed that in progressive supranuclear palsy, square wave jerks, which don't tend to cause oscillopsia, can impair reading, and in fact the frequency of square wave jerks tends to correlate with a degree of difficulty with reading and reading speed. Inability to make an accurate saccade. It's not just fixations. You have to move your eyes to the next spot when you need to figure out what the next word is going to be. So if you have inaccurate saccades from cerebellar lesions, you're not going to be able to make that jump to get the next word accurately. On the other hand, if you have a gaze palsy, you may not be able to make the jump, period. And so people with acquired oculomotor apraxia from bilateral frontal parietal lesions do tend to have problems with reading, among their many other problems. If you have a supranuclear downgaze palsy, again, that makes reading a little more difficult because that's where we tend to hold reading material. One thing that I often have to stress to people is that, people talk, oh, this person has trouble reading and they have trouble with smooth pursuit. So it's this pursuit that's causing their reading problem, right? Well, pursuit has nothing to do with reading, unless you tend to read with your text moving around in front of you for an extra level of challenge or something. Most of the time, you're reading a stationary thing. When you're reading something stationary, pursuit has nothing to do with it. It's just fixations and saccades. This was a young woman who presented with MS, and she'd had 12 years prior presented with optic neuritis. For the last 3 months, she'd had imbalanced poor writing and difficulty reading. And the main finding on her exam was she had macrosaccadic oscillations, making it very difficult for her to maintain steady gaze in order to read. Convergence insufficiency. When I see somebody with Parkinson's disease and they're telling me they have trouble reading, it's almost always convergence insufficiency, even if they don't recognize that it's double vision at close. That's usually the obvious. That's when it's not that difficult, when they do complain of double vision. But sometimes it's just blurring your vision. Someone checks their refraction, they say it looks fine. The presbyopic correction is fine. I don't understand this. But they forget to check to see if they're aligned when they've got the reading material in front of them. And all you have to do is just cover each eye as they're reading, and you'll see that they are actually exotropic. This can occur also with minor head trauma. It's good to pick this one up because it's easy to treat. Sometimes convergence exercises might help. I'm not so convinced about that with the elderly population. Or you can put in base out prisms, or even just the simplest of things, just cover one eye. Starting to get to the neurology side of things now. Attention and reading. There's something called neglect dyslexia. If you have left hemi-neglect, which is often the case if you have a right parietal frontal lesion, you have trouble reading. And there can be two kinds of things that this will do to you. One is a space-centered defect, where you forget to look at the left side of the page. That makes trying to figure out the meaning of what you're reading very interesting when you're only reading half the page. The other possibility that you often see with these people is an object-centered deficit. And in this case, it means that when they see an individual word, they miss out the left side of the word. Even if the word is on the right side of the page, they'll miss the beginning of the word. So, and that could be things like omissions, where they say bright, when bright is read as right because they don't see the B. They might actually make additions where they see right, but they read it as bright instead, which is kind of a curious thing. Or substitutions. They'll read right as light. Vertical printed text is not affected. Of course, we don't often read vertical text, but if you get a chance to try them out, the fact that they can do fine with that might be a good clue to that. One of the important things about this is that you don't have to have all the other signs of hemi-neglect to have neglect dyslexia. It can sometimes be an isolated manifestation of a right-sided parietal or frontal lesion. But the clue is really the kind of errors they're making, right? If someone's making an error because they're missing the left side of the page or the left side of the words, and it's always the left side of things, that's probably neglect dyslexia. This is an example of the eye movements of somebody trying to read this page. You can see they don't go all the way to the left margin, and as time goes by and they read more lines, they end up just reading the words on the right side of the page, period. Okay, but once you get past the attention thing, high-level visual processes. If you have a problem with this, what you have is pure alexia, or alexia without agraphia. Now this can be a spectrum of severity. Global alexia, these subjects can't read anything. They can't read words, they can't read letters, they can't even read numbers. They can't read abstract symbols, which are things like musical notation, road signs, and map symbols. This is really a problem with a very, very gross level. On the other hand, the mild level is letter-by-letter reading. These subjects can read, it's just slower than it used to be. And the key thing here is that their reading is characterized by a word length effect. The more letters there are in the word, the longer it takes for them to read that word. For you and I, it doesn't matter how many letters are in the word. It's pattern recognition. You see the word, you know what it is. These people read the word one letter at a time. And that's what this is trying to show you here, is a number of fixations that these subjects need with words. As the word increases from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 letters, these subjects take more and more and more time and more fixations to do that, whereas hemionopics and control subjects, it's flat function. It doesn't matter how many letters, you take the same amount of time to read it. They almost always have some right hemianopia or superior quadrant anopia, color anomia, and impaired verbal memory as well. The classic finding is a left PCA infarct. As you see in this example here, this is a 52-year-old man who lost the ability to read after a left PCA infarct. He has a macular splitting right hemianopia, an anomia for color and objects. He can't tell real letters from their mirror images. He can't tell real words from meaningless strings of letters. He could, however, read numbers and road signs. There's two main explanations for why pure alexia occurs. One is that it could be a disconnection syndrome. That's illustrated here in this figure from Desjardins from way back in the 1890s. The idea here is that you have two things going on here. You have a left occipital lesion here that causes you to have a right hemianopia. No information from that side of the world. The left side visual field that you can still see is processed by the right side, but it can't get to your left hemisphere, which is where all your verbal processing occurs, because of a lesion of the splenium, or the white matter around the occipital horn. So that's the disconnection part. And indeed, there are some cases that do seem to fulfill this criteria. The other possibility is that it's nothing to do with disconnection of information flow from vision to language processors. It's all about a type of agnosia, a visual agnosia that's selective for words. And the idea here is that there's an area in the left fusiform gyrus called the visual word form area. This is from one of our fMRI studies where you have somebody looking at English, then looking at Korean text. They don't read Korean, but they do read English. The difference between these two tells you a word processing area, and that's down here. And so if you have a lesion of this area here, one of the things you might end up with is an agnosia, because this area is probably responsible for processing the visual words. Last, central linguistic dyslexia. This is really weird stuff. Most often there's subjects who have aphasia and dementia with this, but not always. Alexia with agraphia was described with left angular gyrus lesions, can be associated with Gerstmann syndrome. Some of these turn out to actually be deep dyslexias, which we'll talk about in a second. Linguistic variants. They're called this because they have very interesting characteristics that show that it's nothing to do with really vision. It's all about linguistic processing. Phonological dyslexia and surface dyslexia reflect the fact that there's two ways in which you can learn how to pronounce a word. Okay? One is you can figure out from the rules of pronunciation in your language what this should sound like. The other is you can look it up in a dictionary in your head. Okay? The difference is then, if you've lost the spelling rules, you can't figure out how to pronounce something you haven't seen before because it's not in your dictionary, right? And that's what phonological dyslexia is all about. So if you give these people new words or pseudo words that don't really exist, you say like grickle and centus, how would you pronounce that? They have no idea because they don't have the spelling rules anymore. Okay? You'll know that that's got to be a linguistic problem. On the other hand, those with surface dyslexia, they've lost the dictionary, but they still have the rules. So they can only read as long as the word in front of them follows normal pronunciation rules. right? So if you give them a word that doesn't do that, like yacht or colonel, they don't know how to pronounce that because they don't have the dictionary anymore to look that up. Okay. Deep dyslexia is kind of a variant of this in which there's further problems. These are really weird things where they've lost the rules and they also make semantic errors. When you see the word cat, they say dog. And you're looking at them like they're nuts. Okay? But they're not nuts. That's just the way the brain, there's this kind of really weird, deep dyswiring going on. Okay. Here's an example. This is an alexia with a graphia patient, 55-year-old man who has a glioblastoma. You can see it down here. He has fluent speech, normal comprehension, mild anomia. He does have a macular splitting right hemianopia. He can't read or write, and when he reads, he makes semantic errors. He read beautiful as pretty. He said but was and when he tried to write, when he said write the word spider, he wrote seater, and he wrote hammer's hair. So he clearly has got a deep dyslexia, and as well as he's got an agraphia. So, last slide. So in summary, when reading doesn't work, think about low-level visual processes. Do they have hemianopia? Even just a small hemifield defect at central 5 degrees. Forget about the rest. It's the central 5 degrees you got to examine. Do they have hemifield slide from that bitemporal hemianopia? Those are usually a very characteristic kind of complaint. Remember the vertical step and things. Eye movements. Do they have steady fixation? Are the saccades accurate and working? And does convergence work? Is attention a problem? With this, you should listen very carefully to figure out, are they making problems with the left side of the page or the left side of words? Higher level processes, pure alexia, where they can read but they can write but they can't read. Look for that wordless effect. Does it take them longer to read a 6-letter word than a 1-letter word? And linguistic analysis, alexia with agraphia and the central dyslexias. And just to remind you, that's the website address if you're interested in looking at some of these cases. And I'll stop there.